I'm presenting triaging and the deliberative system in Toronto, and I'm just, before I jump into that, I'll just give you a little brief intro to this photo here. And this is Kensington Market. It's a really cool hipster neighborhood in the downtown core of Toronto, which borders Chinatown. And this is what's considered pedestrian Sunday. And so it's obviously not like that anymore with COVID, but on this little strip here, my favorite cheese shop, artisanal popcorn. This is where I buy my vinyl Motown and old classic reggae vinyl records. And so this is just a snippet of what Toronto has versus seeing what the common photo is, which is the skyline. So I'm just going to do a quick little introduction here to what I'm going to be walking us through here. And so a little bit about methods, a little bit about deliberative systems and the empirical challenge. Then I'm going to jump into three concepts of the deliberative system that I'm thinking about, which is scale, that should be scale, space, and triage, but it says place. Case study, I'm going to look into Special Committee on Governance, which is a City of Toronto governance committee that was formed. And then I'm going to also talk about residents associations and neighborhood planning tables. And then I'm going to jump into a brief discussion about the three functions of the deliberative system and some structural limitations of triaging. So the methods behind what I'm presenting here, and maybe I'll just start by saying that I have circulated a working paper to some folks at the center here. And what that paper really was sort of a descriptive presentation of a lot of what I was thinking about. And it was kind of a deliberate attempt to make it quite descriptive in that regard. And one of the reasons is that you just don't see a heck of a lot of detailed case study research on Toronto. I mean, there is some deliberative Democrats in Canada, like Genevieve Fuji-Johnson, who's written about power and deliberative systems in the Toronto Community Housing Corporation and other forms. Some other folks that write about participatory budgeting and community councils. And so it was largely a descriptive paper, but it gives me an opportunity in this presentation to kind of play around with the more conceptual level, which I hope to kind of explore as well. But nonetheless, the methods behind this is I conducted some semi-structured interviews of city staff and residents. So the city staff were from various departments at the City of Toronto, as well as local city councilors, residents from residents associations. I also dove right into a bunch of City of Toronto reports and some presentations and some of their consultation findings. And some of those findings were found on the Open Data Portal, which is a good resource for things that have been uploaded. I did do a committee analysis, which was roughly 12 to 15 hours of analyzing pre-recorded videos on the Special Committee on Governance. And then there was some observation involved regarding residents associations and neighborhood planning tables. So this is going to be just a very, very high level because most of us are very familiar with the deliberative systems approach. So just as a high level here, and I'm quite interested in the deliberative systems approach. And so this is, sort of my introduction here, that I take it as my sort of departing point here that public duration should be understood beyond isolated practices and to examine relationships between not only particular deliberative sites, but also the relationship between deliberative and non-deliberative practices in the political system over time. And so this has been considered, and that's obviously from folks from our own center that have written about this. And so in the advantages that are accorded to this perspective is that you get to understand deliberative democracy in large-scale societal terms, to analyze the division of labor among parts of a system, and to think about contextual issues and potential inadequacies that have an impact on individual sites that might shape the possibilities of effective deliberation. Now, this kind of leads into sort of the main challenge that I'm working with, or that I'm trying to sort of tackle. And that is specifically what's considered the empirical challenge. And, you know, some of these are enduring critiques that go back a ways. Some of these are far more recent. But, you know, the main idea here is that the sort of real world of politics needs to kind of be empirically reflected upon, and the deliberative systems approach is having somewhat of a challenge in instigating those empirical studies. Now, of course, there are some empirical research that's coming out, but I think that that critique and lingering critique is still something that can be worked on. And hopefully, you know, this is one sort of lens or one way of thinking about this and tackling the empirical challenge. And so my kind of overarching objective, or things that I'm really thinking about, is, and this is perhaps two ways of thinking about it, how is the deliberative system a series of scales and spaces where power, division, integration differentiates, how discursive realms of decision-making interact, and primarily what this actually means for the ability or the inability to address structural problems like inequality, like poverty, like racial inequity. And, or how is public deliberation mediated, reconstituted, recursively produced by complex social relations that are embedded in scalar and spatial divisions of labor within the deliberative system? Now, this kind of leads into, and I'm not going to talk much about my most recent book, but I just want to sort of mention that this is something that I have been thinking about in my most recent work. And though I don't directly talk a lot about deliberative systems within this book, what I do feel that I am doing in this research is laying the foundation. And so I do a pretty comprehensive analysis, I believe, of the political system in Britain at a local, regional, national scale, and the variety of social contests that are involved over time that involve the public. And so the deliberative systems is something that I'm thinking about. It's something that I do mention in some of the chapters, and to kind of situate that from a political economy lens. And so this is me kind of taking this sort of a perspective or expanding upon that in certain ways. And so some of the concepts that I'm working with, space, scale, these are major concepts that I'm imparting from geographers, especially critical geographers, geographers that draw a lot from Gramsci. So a lot of this is potentially, you know, neo-Gramscian perspectives of space and scale. And I'm thinking of, you know, major theorists like Bob Jessup, for example, that talk a lot about this. And so in this perspective, this is not blocking. Space, for example. So space here is socially produced grids and horizons of social life. And the important point here is that actors are constantly constructing space, they're reproducing it, they're occurring within it. And so there is an active involvement in space. Now, the spatial division of deliberative labor, I mean, this is a term that I'm sort of playing with, but it's to kind of get across this idea, which draws upon previous work of Doreen Massey or others that talk about the spatial division of labor. Now, I'm thinking about this, you know, in terms of deliberative democracy. And so the way that I kind of apply this is thinking about this in terms of the division of discursive activities that are happening between and within neighborhoods of Toronto, and how are these actually working to address unequal power relations. And so one of the things about the spatial division of labor in the geographical lens is they're really looking at the way in which capitalist relations are operating and how that impacts, you know, specific sort of social reproductive contests that are happening within civil society and in politics. Scale is another concept. And so these are the bounded space that reflect economic, political, intellectual, moral power, and they can involve both territorial and non-territorial expressions. And so here I'm thinking about scalar hierarchies of the deliberative division of labor. And so I particularly have in mind the leveraging of authority in legal or constitutional ways across geographic, provincial, and local scales in order to structure discursive opportunities. And then the third concept I have here is triaging. And so I'll talk on the next slide where I got this term from, but triaging by Cambridge definition is examining problems in order to decide which ones are the most serious and must be dealt with first. And so in Toronto, triaging operates in terms of convening stakeholders to deliberate on how local problems should be sorted. And so it's interesting to think about triaging in medical terms, whereby you have perhaps a medical office and people coming in with physical ailments are being directed by a nurse for those who have the most severe priorities that need to be directed in certain ways or need to be addressed first, where others are waiting, waiting to be served in that sense. And so problems that arise in Toronto in a similar way is something that triaging kind of operates in. And so I got this actually from two forms of research. One was an interview and the other one was from a city document where triage was the terminology that was used, which makes me really consider that this is something that the public and both the city are actively thinking about. And I had never really come across it before until then. And so, as you can see here, one of the members of a resident association had basically described their operations as triaging with other groups in order to address, a world of neglected things that happen, and some of them get put off, some of them get worked on, and it's somewhat of a challenge in order to operate in this way. And then the city had a document that talks about triaging local issues and coordinating divisional resources to help build local capacity. And so I think this concept is something that is relevant to what I'm going to be presenting with regard to the case study. And so I'll jump right into the case study, which is, the first one is the Special Committee on Governance. But what I'm going to do is kind of give a background to how the Special Committee on Governance came to be. And so the best way to think about this, in my opinion, in many ways, is to think about local scale restructuring. And so if we think about Toronto in the left image there, at one point it was, before it became a mega city. And by the way, as a result of that amalgamation and a lot of development, Toronto is now the fourth most populous city in North America. It's a city with over 200 languages spoken, 47% of the population are immigrants, so it's quite a large and a diverse city. 3 million people, I believe, in Toronto proper. And so the background here is that in the late 1990s, a neoliberal premier basically decided to amalgamate what was effectively different metropolitan governance layers into one city of Toronto. And so this created sort of a problem in terms of representation from the other communities. Now, so on this list here, I don't know if anyone can see it, but it says Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, York, East York, Old Toronto. This is what Drake calls the six boroughs. And so these sort of outer areas left a gap. And so there was an opportunity within the sort of legislation that amalgamated the city to create community councils. Now, these community councils were open for a lot of interpretation. And what was chosen and discussion on this matter was that they could potentially become spheres of participatory democracy that kind of sit right beneath the local government layer. And that's not what the city created. The city decided to create a more legislative efficiency, where these boundaries, where these community councils are where you go and deal with business licensing and variance issues and the like. Now, the other background to to the Special Committee on Governance is ward boundary reform. And so I'm sort of drawing the through line that 20 years ago, a conservative government was elected and changed the boundaries of governance and democracy in Toronto and its surrounding region. And then in 2018, a new premier was elected. It's the first time since the provincial government had changed hands to a conservative, and radical transformation of ward boundaries were implemented. And so this is kind of a problem, or it's a big problem as a matter of fact, because the city of Toronto on the left-hand side was set to implement 47 wards. And so this was after, you know, multiple rounds of consultation, over 20, I believe 20 public consultations were held. And the city council had passed the motion to implement new ward boundaries. And what you're essentially seeing here is an increased amount of representation. New government comes in 2018, says, no, we're going to actually reduce the amount, cutting the amount of effective representation in half. And so a whole lot of problems arise from this, you know, not least because what you're dealing with is that this was implemented 3 months before the election. So people had to scramble to create this sort of new governance system. But what happened was an opportunity. I mean, there were legal battles and they're still ongoing. And I believe that the Supreme Court of Canada is going to be reviewing this move. It's supposed to, I don't know if COVID is going to change that at some point at some point this year. Nonetheless, one of the things that I think is relevant in thinking about Scalar hierarchies or Scalar participation, I mean, the local level is, technically speaking, according to the Canadian Constitution, a sort of a so-called creature of the province, where, you know, a lot of its mandate has to come with it. But on the flip side, it has its own opportunities to craft what its own governance structure is within certain boundaries. And so that's where the Special Committee on Governance comes from. In 2018, City Council directs this committee to overlook all potential political restructuring opportunities and to consider what this might, you know, be considered by City Council. And so they implement what is a special committee format, and they started as a committee style. And I was tempted to actually show a video of this because I'm actually quite fascinated with the presentations, the deputations that were given at this committee. Some of them had a lot of really interesting ideas, and I'll go through those later on. But the committee style. And so basically this is just your standard. You get 5 minutes to depute on the matter in front of this panel. And this panel is essentially appointed by the mayor. And so there were problems from the start because the public were not really satisfied with this. They really were disappointed in this committee style. And the committee was set to do roughly 5 meetings. And so imagine that you have 5 meetings to consider all of the potential issues related to governance reform and the restructuring challenges that came as a result of those ward boundary changes. And so people were quite upset. That came back with, you know, a little bit of support from the city manager's office, saying, okay, what we're going to actually do is we're going to implement a broader consultation plan. And so within this consultation plan, basically what we have is the city set up an opportunity to, you know, participate in an online survey. And what they said they were going to do is they were going to hold public consultations. And I don't know if you recall a couple slides back, in those 4 quadrants. And that's essentially to provide geographic representation or the opportunity for more diverse participants to show up rather than having to trek their way downtown to make a deputation. These consultations, moreover, we're going to have an opportunity to have more deliberative roundtables, is how they were described. Now, out of the 5 discussions that were had, 47 people showed up, 5 people to 1 of them. And so you're left with this bigger question of, do you blame the Toronto Raptors? And I say this because this was when the Toronto Raptors was in the playoffs. They ended up winning. And, you know, it's just an interesting sort of dynamic. 2 million people show up to, you know, the Toronto Raptors winning the NBA finals, but you can't get 5 people, you know, out their door into a public consultation about basically what is their local democracy. And so there's a lot of questions about who's to blame for that, or whether or not that is a problem whatsoever. That said, there were final report recommendations made, and one was, and this was made by the city manager's office, to retain the interim governance model adopted, which was basically to it was basically to keep things as they are previously and prior to the ward boundary reforms. The only things that were changed were basically the size of the committees, and the council, the community council boundaries were adapted to the geography. No major structural issues were changed. That's kind of what this special committee was for. And the second recommendation that they made was to consider partnering with a post-secondary institute to research the Committee of Adjustment, to research where, you know, variance and zoning issues have happened. Now, this brings up one point that was made by an interview participant at senior executive that said, if I almost verbatim, the public has a right to participate, but almost nearly all advice that's being given on issues related to governments is coming from the bureaucracy. And in this instance, it was the city manager's office. And so you have to ask yourself whether or not they were operating as an impartial actor. And, you know, I'm somewhat on the fence, because I know I had previously worked at the City of Toronto, and so I've had multiple conversations with folks that work at the city manager's office and various other departments. But you know, there are some challenges here on why only 2 recommendations were made when this list of items that I could see before you were presented by the deputants. And so we had some pretty, you know, outstanding ideas that were presided, and resident-led community boards. And so one resident wrote like a 50-page document on community boards based off of New York. Someone had advocated for participatory budgeting, expanded beyond our own pilots that we had, citizens assemblies, referendums, a secretary to offer office of neighborhoods. And these basically would be akin to I think more library supports that are provided at the parliamentary level, or so basically you have an opportunity to rely on bureaucratic staff for research and other sorts of logistical supports. There was conversations about community councils and actually having resident representation, because currently there are no residents that are represented on community councils. It's only city councilors. Participatory community councils. And then another interesting idea was, well, we now have 25 wards. Why not we bring together interest groups from each ward and create 25 group boards? And so all of these ideas were kind of thrust aside, and no serious recommendations were made on their behalf. And so this kind of brings me to a conversation where I had with the city councilor, who was also a member on that specific committee. And so this member and city councilor had basically said that from the get-go, there was a real challenge between the members on the committee. And ultimately what happened was, no motions were passed at that committee, which meant essentially that when it came time for city council to review the mandate and the findings, there was nothing. And so they had to craft a bunch of motions on the floor of the city council in order to try and get things going with respect to potential reforms. Now, as we can see here, the challenges from this quote is that it's looking like nothing will come about from this. I mean, there were some interesting motions that were passed, but the real opportunity was for them to actually have been able to vote at the council chambers on these issues. And so there's a lot of politics involved with this. But I think perhaps the bigger issue is that, you know, thinking about this in terms of a deliberative system, this isn't necessarily the most deliberative way, even though the City of Toronto talked about how those consultative roundtables were deliberative. It starts to get us to think a little bit more about how the bureaucracy is involved within discursive opportunities. It starts to get us to think in certain ways about how, you know, potentially, you know, scalar relations, or the relations between different political scales, might impact other sorts of deliberative spaces and opportunities. And so this kind of leads us into the next two, which are definitely a bit more they're definitely better spaces to look for in terms of models, not without their own problems though. And so residents associations is the other one, is one of them. Residents associations, and why I'm specifically focusing on this one is because there were a lot of deputants at that special committee that advocated on behalf of them and really wanted them to have far more supports than they're currently provided. And so this is also interesting because if you think about residents associations, some of their roots go back, quite a long time. And, one of the more familiar or famous participants of a residents association that was an advocate is in Toronto was Jane Jacobs. And so a lot of these have, grounding in Toronto and roots. So just to kind of give you an overview here on the left-hand side. And so this is an interesting, this is a very interesting diagram done by some local civic activists at tango.to. And so they're essentially here trying to chart, how residents associations in terms of their geography and their space. Now, you'll notice here that some of the black ones are considered, the blackish gray ones are considered sort of dormant or inactive. And so there really is sort of a conglomeration into the middle there. And as we're going to talk about further, this is sort of part of the problem with the way that spatial divisions of deliberative labor operate, especially with the residents associations. Now, we can contrast these residents associations with business improvement areas, which are also, if you notice, very conglomerated in the downtown core of Toronto. Now, the difference here is that these business improvement areas are formally recognized by the City of Toronto. They have a business improvement area office. There are other specific types of supports that are provided to them, but residents associations don't have anything of the like. And so a lot of criticism has come with why aren't there any supports provided to these residents associations? And so there isn't a whole lot of work or research done charting, these resident associations. And so it's one of those things where, only few research has been able to work within these bounds. Now, the residents associations, I think probably, there are two things that I want to draw upon. And one of them is what their relationship is specifically to the local planning appeal tribunal and to private development more broadly. And so one of the really fascinating research studies that have been done on residents associations in Toronto by, I believe, Alexander Flynn, who might be at the University of British Columbia now, but she charted a really interesting analysis of residents associations. And basically what was showed was that, over 180 residents associations, something over 70% of their focus is on planning and development. Now, if you go back to where they're located, a lot of these residents associations are really conglomerated in the downtown, and that's because that's where a lot of development and densification and private developers are really focused on. Now, one of the interesting things that has arisen is that, as a mandate locally, the City of Toronto, anytime a development proposal is put forth, a developer has to convene a public meeting, and what could arise out of it potentially is one of these sort of management committees. And so this is considered a working group. Basically, this is an opportunity for a residents association to sort of massage a project, to massage a development proposal, to make it a little bit more amicable to the community in certain regards. Now, the challenge with this is that it entirely favors the goodwill of, the group. And if it doesn't, operate in the sort of circumstances that, say a private developer would prefer, they have recourse to the local planning appeal tribunal. And this is the only one of its kind in North America because it can override city council objectives. Basically, what can happen is a local planning, basically a private developer that doesn't like any conversations that are happening about the way a private development is happening or the way that it was pitched, it can actually go to a local planning appeal tribunal, and the local judge or the appellate could basically decide in favor of their appeal. essentially overriding community interests. And it's been found that, increasingly over the past few years that this is what's been happening. And one judge, has favored, it's been on the LPAT for over 15 years, has ruled 75% in favor of private developers. Now, of course, that is a big challenge, but it doesn't mean that that residents associations aren't actually, coordinating certain forms of community action. And so this is taken specifically from my own residents association of where I live. Now, a lot of what they're trying to do, we can see, is build alliances, and a lot of the pressures on the neighborhood are extensive condo development, property ownership, and things that are related to that sort. But what we're left with is this idea that residents associations are operating within an unequal dynamic of power relations. And they have to work within this sort of so-called interstitial space, kind of between private developers, between the city. And so there are some challenges, and they're able to actually navigate these processes, but it is a difficult thing. Neighborhood planning tables. And so neighborhood planning tables is also a very interesting thing, I find as well, for the way that they operate, but I think it fits quite well with the spatial analysis that I'm sort of providing here. And the neighborhood planning tables were also something that were talked about at the Special Committee on Governance. Now, just to be a little bit of a background here, is that recent research is showcasing how unequal Toronto is actually becoming. And so some excellent work coming out of, I think it's John David Holchansky's work, and on the 3 Torontos. And so what we essentially see here on the left-hand side is that the downtown core is where, obviously a lot of the development is happening. It's also where the sort of economic engine is happening. This is where the economic clusters of the health sector, the tech sector, the tertiary knowledge industries are conglomerated. It's also where income has increased over time for the past 20 years. And as you go outward, you start to see the rise of inequality in terms of income. But not only that, there's a level of residential sorting that's happening. We're talking about, over the past little while, the concept of ethnoburbs. And so on the outskirts, what you're starting to see here is a conglomeration of racial minorities. And this is also coinciding with, income inequality amidst other systemic sort of issues. And so this leads us to the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, which is, its most recent iteration. This is something that goes back roughly 15 years, but this specific strategy, which is, I find, a rather interesting project. What they did is they worked through the World Health Organization's Urban Heart Index to assess the quality of urban neighborhood health. And they did it across 5 domains. It was economic opportunity, social development, physical infrastructure, healthy lives, and participation in civic decision-making. So out of the 140 neighborhoods that are found in Toronto, you can see that there are 31 neighborhoods, again, on the outer skirts of Toronto, in the inner burbs. And so these 31 neighborhoods are considered sorely underdeveloped. And what they wanted to do is create a strategy of working towards developing these sorts of 5 domains and increasing the health so that they can bring them up to a level that other neighborhoods and cities, other neighborhoods in Toronto are operating. Now, this leads us to one of the strategies, which is neighborhood planning tables. And so in each of these across the 31 neighborhood improvement areas, there are 15 neighborhood planning tables. So these are tables that convene monthly to prioritize one of the domains or multiple of those domains, and they work alongside each other with public service providers and with residents. Now, in some cases, these tables are very resident focused, and some cases they're far more focused on the service providers. And so it depends on the table itself and how it operates. But what they're trying to essentially do is work towards prioritizing, certain types of activities that might enhance, resident capacity, might address, certain forms of skill gaps, And some of these projects are specifically led by residents. And so you'll see at neighborhood planning tables, community grants that are offered to residents that want to host financial literacy projects, or they want to build social fabric by having community events. Now, the interesting thing about if I bring this back to residents associations is you can see that there is this sort of city-driven strategy to work within, you know, the sort of underdeveloped neighborhoods on the outskirts, and then you have this sort of volunteer-based residents associations that have no sorts of city support but form on their own, working within the downtown core. And so it presents a sort of picture of how things are operating at a spatial level and the sort of dynamic that's happening. You know, and perhaps this is one way for us to start to think about, you know, what is a deliberative system in this regard. And so this kind of leads me into the final part of my presentation, a little bit about the discussion. And so in thinking about what I had as my objective recap, I had mentioned, you know, a little bit about scales and spaces, power division, and, you know, how space is reconstituted and recursively produced. I had sort of two thoughts or two sort of critiques that I wanted to kind of situate myself in. And so one of them is on the three functions of what I call the three functions of the deliberative system, as I found it aligned with the three forms of deliberatives, or the three forms of the case studies that I had talked about. And so I'm drawing from recent work by Corrado, Hammond, and Min on power and deliberative democracy, where there is a critique here of moving beyond thinking about the functionality of the deliberative system. It's not simply about one site filling in for the gaps of others, because some are going to be very excellent. And to be honest with you, Toronto is, you know, home to world leader of you know, of certain forms of reference panels. So we have Mass LBP, for example, and so they've partnered with the City of Toronto before on some excellent projects. But I'm trying to think beyond what, you know, some focus on, and think about this at a systemic and a broad terrain. And so we have to present a picture that's not of a neutral or ambiguous deliberative system, but to actually lay bare those apparent tensions. And so in thinking about that, these are sort of the functionalities of these sorts of different spaces that I found. And so the Special Committee on Governance, I felt, served as a deferring role. From the outset, its whole goal was to scope what was up for conversation. It actually obfuscated what the public had presented. There were written submissions where the public had to write about saying that their thoughts and opinions weren't actually be accurately represented in the reporting back. And then in the end, the sort of opportunity to present interesting or innovative ideas were modified. And that's sort of a disappointing thing, because there was a real opportunity that was lost with the Special Committee on Governance. Moving to the function of a resident association, I find that they serve as a resolving function, and that's because their primary role is to negotiate, and they're negotiating on behalf of their community, but with developers. They have to conciliate and they have to mediate. And so these are the sorts of challenges they deal with, because the power relations within the planning sphere specifically. And then the neighborhood planning tables work in a connecting function. And so their primary goal is to augment social relationships within the communities, to coordinate certain sorts of community actions, and to allocate some funds on behalf of the community and on behalf of the City of Toronto. And so this kind of gets us thinking a little bit about how the deliberative system is sort of operating in these sorts of functions. Now, it's not entirely, and what I'm hoping to present here is that this is a more nuanced picture, that the residents associations are spaces of inspiration personally, and so are neighborhood planning tables. In fact, I really applaud the work that's being done. These are volunteers that go to work, and then they spend countless hours perusing, you know, legal S in the case of residents associations, the neighborhood planning tables, really trying to coordinate a lot of actions. It's more, though, thinking about how we might want to further enhance some of these or change them altogether. And so this leads me into my second critique, which is the structural limitations of triaging. And so I found that triaging is a reactive process. It involves sorting and prioritizing rather than getting ahead of problems. And so your goal is to basically deal with incoming issues as they arise. And it can be somewhat challenging when, so many issues are coming in where you potentially cannot, address or deal with them. Now, in the case of neighborhood planning tables, it might be said that, well, they're actually trying to plan ahead. But the way that I look at this is that it's a far more complicated picture to develop economic opportunities at these local planning tables when you have an economic cluster model, basically that's fomenting in the downtown core, and it's really focused on the tertiary sectors. And so the precarity of labor and the way that things are operating not necessarily can be dealt with at a local neighborhood planning table or a place-based strategy level. And so it leads me to the next conclusion here that triaging enforces a spatial disconnection of involved efforts. And so in this sense, you have a lot of different communities that are working on very similar issues, but they're very disconnected from one another, and they're really focused on really prioritizing for their own micro level in their own neighborhood. And then this connects to triaging reproduces scalar hierarchies within the bureaucracy and the political system. And so you have here, automatically, which is, the challenge from the get-go, which is the way in which politics operates in perhaps a vertical way. But what it does reproduce in terms of the challenges is that when there are opportunities, you have, the political and bureaucratic system, which can necessarily circumscribe how certain activities are operating and the potential for deliberative democracy to flourish even more than it does. And so this kind of leads me to some future thoughts, or just some thoughts in general about interventions. And so what I'm thinking about in this regard is, how do we mutually constitute spatial divisions of labor that overlap and support each other? How do we get, neighborhood associations or residents associations or local planning tables thinking about each other, thinking about the broader city, thinking about the broader scale of issues? How do you pursue mechanisms that might militate against dominating scalar hierarchies? How do we address, specific logics that are being applied by certain scales of the governments that are operating in Ontario and in Toronto? And then overarching expansion of the scope of public deliberation beyond triaging. And so thinking about collective efforts across both space and scale. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be thinking about more in the future. And I'll be closing with that. Thank you very much.